Lecture 9. And in this lecture, what we'll do is introduce Google, the original Google model for internet search. The real key here is the business model. And after that, we'll talk about how in the next lecture after that, the lecture fourth part of this Lecture 9, we'll discuss how Google runs innovation process to look forward better than most modern companies in our economy right now. Welcome to the second company that we're going to talk about, which is the third part of the Lecture 9 series on companies that are sort of new within the last decade that have gained a reputation being somewhat innovative. So Google innovation is another very interesting example. We had Apple that we determined had medium scale innovation in the iPod, but the sequence of iPod, iPhone, iPad gets more incremental. And it's because the number of elements that we're allowing to intersect and go into a new direction are limited as we go down to the iPad, especially if you look at the iPad with reference to the pre-existing product of the iPhone. Although if you look at it separately, you could still say, okay, if I look at it in parallel, it's sort of as innovative as the iPhone. But considering that all the additional technology features, or almost all of them, were in the iPhone, then if you reference the iPhone, it's actually the most incremental product that they've produced in the last 5 years or whatever it is. So let's look at Google now. And a lot of people aren't really familiar with the history of Google. And as we always talk about from a historical perspective, we're limiting the number of iterations by describing Google's history in such a short segment here. However, you probably by now know that it's not linear and that Google didn't arrive at its business model and all of its technology by 5 years previously sitting down and writing exactly how it was going to make money, everything else. The first thing that happened was Google. It was definitely a company that started in the technology space, looking at the uncertainty there first, knowing that if you look at what was going on at the time, people wanted to search the web. And so the big question in the technology bubble was that there was many ways to do this. There was different companies doing different things. And of course the classic story was that Google wanted to do things like download the data on the web, analyze it, and figure out how to develop better technology for searching the web, a different way to search the web. So this is all important, and this has been written about, and you can look at how there were a lot of technology options when they started, and that they were able to kind of narrow this down. Now the problem that the other search companies had, even to this day, is that the market was easy for them, and this is true of a lot of web companies that we'll talk about. The one thing that, if you think about companies that come on and use sort of the end of the information age paradigm to work, because in a way, if you go further back, you could say, well, Google depends on Moore's law and all this sort of stuff. But as a separate company, and because all that stuff was evolving before they existed, so we have to look at Google as a separate company in its own process. And so when it started, the market was simply the search market on the web, and that's it. They wanted to help people find things on the web. So it's actually quite a very specific market application. Again, there's different people in there, but all these companies were talking about generic search, essentially. Not, the search engine for all is what they were more or less after. And what was very interesting is that our good old implementation, which a lot of companies were doing at the time, was not really being considered, and that's largely because a lot of these sort of information age paradigm companies at the very end, especially near the bubble, the .com bubble, really didn't consider that at all, right? Because remember, what's in implementation are things like, cost, business model, and not all companies, like you're about later, our first company, bringing the strained silicon innovation to the marketplace, that company was starting and growing in the same time period as Google, but it was in a completely different investment space. So in our case, implementation was hammered on by every investor quite extensively. But you got to remember that in the bubble, the classic thing that was done in the .com bubble is that you suspend, and of course the sister of this we'll talk about later was the social network, bubble, bubble 2.0, if you will, where many companies raise capital without actually looking at implementation. And the danger of this, of course, you can see now why it's never a good idea if you want to have a real innovation in the marketplace kind of optimized for all these parts. It's never a good idea to just iterate between these, because of course you could converge on something, and then when you try to come in and after the fact do implementation, as you see, rarely do you converge on a viable company. Viability is questionable, and of course that's why our focusing on the human process of innovating, you have to be evolving this while you're evolving these. You can't let them just interact, because as we have said, implementation affects these and they all affect each other. But Google got a lucky break, and this is one of the classic things in Google, because I think they're really smart guys, the founders are, and they're very interested in innovation. They actually admit that, of course, they're doing this innovation process. They knew they had a good search technology, but it was actually, I believe, the sixth employee of the company that was really thinking about this, even though they didn't need to at that time. Remember, you can raise as much capital as you want without thinking about implementation. And so implementation was introduced, and I have no idea. It could be because the founders said to do it. It could be because there's only 6 people in the company, and this person's very innovative and could see that they're going to have to eventually make money. That you can probably read all of the stories behind Google and fill in the pieces that I'm not telling you here. But what is very interesting is that the 6th employee came up with the key thing, which is AdWords. So AdWords is that thing that originally used to be off to the right side, where it would keep track of what you're doing and things like that, and then would put things that you're likely to want to go to over here, and that could be sold to advertisers. And not only that, you say, well, that's okay, but the real kicker was that there's statistics that allow the customer to believe that it has increased value compared to regular advertising. So if you think about that process, right, you're now opening up implementation still fairly early in the company, because remember, it's the 6th employee, right? So the company's still pretty small. Well, it's the 6th employee, but it's a little bit later in time, but the point is that um, it all of a sudden introduces a lot of innovation because nobody, as I said, is they're just thinking about, I have a market, I have to do a technology. It's all about the technology. I'm going to shove it into this market, and nobody is really, especially in the other search companies, they're not really good, or maybe they had no effort in, who knows, but opening up implementation space and considering different business models and how you're actually going to create revenue did not seem to be a main focus for a lot of the companies. And worse, investors would tell people, just get more users, just get more users, we'll figure out how to do it later, which is this problem over here. And of course, that's a disaster. And so, whether it's by design or by luck, whoever knows, if you ever meet these folks, you can ask them. But Apple, by opening up the implementation space fairly early on in the company, while the technology is still being developed, allowed them to converge on a better innovation than anybody else. And so Google ended up being the winner because it involved implementation thinking very early on. And by thinking about various business models, they were able to converge on this idea, which really has been a gravy train for them. Now, let's stop there, because as inventive and as innovative as this was, this is only the start for Google. And the real sign that Google is one of the few companies on this planet that I would say, in all my work in innovation, is the closest to doing this innovation process that we're talking about in this class over and over again. And so we'll come back, now that we got the original Google done and understand why it's throwing off all this cash, we will come back in the next part of this lecture and talk about Google's innovation engine for other things.